The mountains were old before the first fish learned to breathe air, old before the continents had names or shapes that any living eye could recognize. And tonight, as you settle deeper into the warmth that holds you, as the weight of the day begins to loosen its grip on your shoulders and your jaw and the small, tired muscles behind your eyes, we are going to walk together into those ancient folds of stone and shadow, into the Appalachian hollows, where the ridgelines curve inward like the spines of sleeping animals, where the darkness is not something to fear, but something to rest inside of, the way you might rest inside a cathedral, built not by hands, but by the slow, incomprehensible patience of geological time. The air here smells of wet bark and cold granite, and the faintest trace of iron, rising up from springs that have been filtering through the same fractured bedrock since long before the first human footprint pressed into the mud of any continent. And if you breathe it in slowly, if you let it fill your chest the way the mist fills these valleys each evening, you will feel something in you begin to quiet, some restless turning of thought beginning to slow like a wheel losing its momentum. These are the oldest mountains on Earth, worn down by 400 million years of rain and ice and the patient, unhurried weight of gravity itself. And they have been holding this silence for so long that the silence has become a thing with texture and depth. A silence you can lean into, a silence that will hold you the way the valley holds the fog, gently, completely, without any need for explanation. Let us begin where the paved road ends, where the asphalt gives way to gravel, and the gravel gives way to a track of packed red clay that winds between walls of rhododendron so dense that the branches interlock overhead like fingers clasped in prayer, forming a tunnel of dark, waxy leaves through which only the thinnest slivers of remaining light can penetrate. The tires of the old truck have gone quiet now, the engine cooling with small ticking sounds that fade into the enormous stillness the way a stone fades into a pond, and we step out into air that is noticeably cooler, 10 degrees colder than the ridge above, because the hollow has been gathering shade all day, the way a bowl gathers water, letting it pool and deepen until the cold becomes something almost liquid, something you can feel pressing softly against the exposed skin of your face and hands. There is a mailbox here at the end of the track, its door hanging open, its interior furred with the pale green of old moss, and beyond it a footpath leads downward between hemlocks whose trunks are wider than the span of your arms, trees that were saplings when the first European settlers came over the ridgeline with their long rifles and their bewildered, wondering eyes. And if you place your hand flat against the bark of one of these trees, you can feel something that is not quite warmth and not quite vibration, but something in between, some deep, patient pulse that seems to rise from the roots themselves. The path descends along the shoulder of the ridge, switchbacking through stands of tulip poplar and white oak, whose canopy is so high and so complete that the forest floor below exists in a perpetual twilight, a soft, brown, shadowless world of decomposing leaves and shelf fungus, and the occasional pale ghost of an Indian pipe plant rising from the humus like a tiny lantern made of wax. Each footstep is cushioned by this deep layer of accumulated years, seasons upon seasons of fallen leaves, compressed into a spongy, fragrant carpet that gives slightly beneath your weight and releases. With each step, a scent that is the distilled essence of autumn multiplied across centuries, sweet and dark and faintly tannic, like tea brewed from the memory of every October that has ever passed through this hollow. The trail here is not marked by blazes or cairns, but by the subtle wearing of the ground itself, a path made legible only by the passage of feet over decades, the feet of people who knew these mountains the way you know the hallways of your own home, by feel, by the particular angle of the slope, by the sound the creek makes when you are drawing near to the place where the old footbridge used to be. And it is the creek we hear now, growing steadily louder as we descend, not the rushing, urgent sound of white water, but something more complex and conversational, a braiding of dozens of small voices as the water finds its way over and around and between the sandstone ledges that step down the hillside like a staircase built for someone much larger and much more patient than any human being. The water is clear to the point of near invisibility, so transparent that the creek seems to be made not of water at all, but of liquid glass flowing over stones that glow in shades of rust and amber and deep iron gray, stones that were laid down as sediment on the floor of a shallow sea that covered this entire region 400 million years ago, when the Appalachians were not the gentle rounded mountains we see today, but a range as sharp and high as the Himalayas, their peaks sheathed in ice, their flanks carved by glaciers whose weight was sufficient to press the Earth's crust down into the mantle itself. All of that height, all of that terrible, magnificent sharpness has been worn away by time, reduced to these soft, undulating ridgelines, these deep hollows, this water that flows over the ancient stone with the unhurried tenderness of a hand smoothing the covers of a bed. On the internal maps used by search and rescue teams in these parts of Appalachia, certain areas are marked with small red circles, notations that do not appear in any official documentation or public database, but are passed instead from one generation of rescuers to the next through quiet conversations held in the amber light of station houses after the shift has ended and the radios have gone still. The circles do not indicate danger in the way that a cliff edge or a flooded river might be dangerous, but rather something more subtle and more difficult to articulate, a quality of certain hollows and certain ridgelines that resists easy description, a tendency for compasses to drift, for GPS signals to scatter and reform in patterns that do not correspond to any known position, for sound to behave in ways that seem to fold space itself so that a shout carries not outward but downward, absorbed by the laurel and the rhododendron and the deep wet earth as completely as if the hollow had simply chosen not to repeat it. The veterans who maintain these maps do not speak of these places with fear exactly, but with a kind of quiet respect that borders on reverence, the way a sailor might speak of a particular stretch of open ocean, not as something hostile, but as something so vast and so fundamentally indifferent to human concerns that the only appropriate response is a deep and settled humility, a willingness to stand at the edge and listen without demanding that the listening yield any particular meaning. We are approaching such a place now, and the first thing you notice is not something you see or hear, but something you feel, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a barely perceptible change in the weight of the atmosphere against your eardrums, as though the hollow ahead of us exists at a slightly different altitude than the surrounding terrain, though the topographic maps show no such variation. The rhododendron here has grown into what the old mountain people call a hell, a thicket so dense and so intricately woven that it forms a living architecture of dark, twisted branches and leathery leaves, a tunnel that extends for hundreds of yards along the creek bank, its ceiling so low in places that you must duck and turn sideways to pass through. And inside this tunnel, the light takes on a quality that is difficult to describe, a deep underwater green that seems to emanate not from above, but from the leaves themselves, as though the rhododendron has been collecting light all day and is now releasing it slowly, reluctantly, in wavelengths that the human eye can barely detect. The temperature drops as we enter, and the air grows damp and still, and the sound of the creek, which was so clear and present just moments ago, becomes muffled and distant, as though we have crossed some invisible threshold into a pocket of silence that the hollow has been maintaining for longer than anyone can remember. Inside the laurel hell, the world contracts to the space immediately around your body, the rough texture of the branches brushing against your sleeves, the soft gave of the moss beneath your feet, the way your breath hangs in the cool air for just a moment before dissolving into the general dampness. And there is something deeply restful about this contraction, this narrowing of the world to the immediate and the tactile. Because in here, there is nothing to see beyond the next few feet of twisted branch, and nothing to think about beyond the next careful placement of your foot on the uneven ground. The bark of the rhododendron is smooth in some places and rough in others, peeling away in thin, papery strips that reveal a paler layer beneath, like the pages of a very old book whose binding has come loose. And if you pause and run your fingers along one of these trunks, you can feel the grain of the wood spiraling upward in a slow helix, following the same mathematical curve that governs the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the spiral of a galaxy, the particular way that water circles as it drains. Because nature, in its deepest operations, returns again and again to the same handful of forms, the same patient geometries, as though the universe itself were dreaming, and these shapes were the recurring images of that dream. An old man who spent 40 years on search and rescue in these mountains once sat on the tailgate of his truck at the end of a long day and said, in a voice roughened by decades of calling across ridgelines and into the bowls of hollows, that the mountains do not take people so much as they simply hold onto them, the way a grandmother holds onto a child who has fallen asleep in her lap, not out of any intention to keep them, but simply because the holding itself has become the most natural thing in the world, and that when he found someone who had been lost for days in one of these deep hollows, they were rarely frightened, rarely panicked, but instead had about them a quality of stillness, of settledness, as though they had been listening to something they could not quite hear, and the listening had gentled them, had worn away the sharp edges of their fear, the way the water wears away the stone. He said this while looking out across the blue ridgelines that stretched to the horizon in every direction, each one a slightly paler shade of blue than the last, and the light was failing, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, and his words hung in the cool evening air with the same quality of quiet permanence as the mountains themselves, as though they had always been there, waiting to be spoken. We emerge from the laurel hell into a small clearing, a place where the canopy opens just enough to admit a single broad shaft of light, though the light at this hour is not the bright gold of afternoon, but something softer and more diffuse, a silver-gray luminescence that seems to have no particular source, as though the sky itself were glowing with the residual warmth of a day that has long since ended. The clearing is carpeted with a thick layer of sphagnum moss, so soft and so deeply green that it looks almost black in this light. And at the center of the clearing there is a spring, not a dramatic upwelling, but a quiet seep, water rising from the ground so slowly and so steadily that the surface of the small pool it has formed is as still as glass, reflecting the canopy above with such clarity that for a moment you cannot tell which is the real forest and which is the reflection. And this doubling, this sense of the world folded upon itself, is one of the qualities that the old search and rescue maps note with their small red circles, this feeling that certain places in the mountains exist simultaneously in two registers, the physical and something else, something for which we do not have a precise name, but which we recognize instinctively, the way we recognize the feeling of being watched by kind eyes from a great distance. The water in the spring tastes of iron and limestone and something else, something mineral and ancient that coats the tongue with a faint metallic sweetness, and the old people of these mountains believed that certain springs had the power to quiet the mind, to slow the racing thoughts that kept a person awake at night, and they would walk for miles through the laurel and the hemlock to reach such a spring and drink from it, cupping the water in their hands the way you might cup a small bird, gently, with reverence, and then sitting beside it for a time, saying nothing, watching the water rise and the light change and the shadows lengthen across the moss, and whether the water itself possessed any particular property, or whether it was simply the act of walking all that way and sitting all that time in the presence of something so old and so steady. The effect was the same. The mind quieted, the body grew heavy and warm despite the cool air, and sleep came the way the water came, rising slowly from some deep hidden source that could not be located or explained, only received. The light is fading now, and as it fades, the hollow deepens around us, the shadows pooling and merging until the individual shapes of trees and stones and fallen logs dissolve into a single continuous darkness, not the flat, featureless darkness of a closed room, but a dimensional darkness, a darkness with layers and textures and varying densities, so that you can sense the bulk of the mountainside rising to the east, even though you can no longer see it, can feel the open space of the creek valley stretching away to the south, can intuit the presence of the laurel hell behind you by the particular quality of stillness that radiates from it like heat from a stone that has been warmed all day by the sun. This is the hour when the forest makes its most intimate sounds, the soft creak of a branch adjusting to the change in temperature, the distant liquid trill of a hermit thrush singing its vesper song from somewhere high on the ridgeline, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small unseen creature goes about its ancient business in the undergrowth. And each of these sounds arises from the silence and returns to the silence so gently that it is difficult to say where the sound ends and the silence begins. Because here, in this hollow sound and silence, are not opposites, but variations of the same fundamental stillness, the same deep, abiding quiet that has been accumulating in these mountains since the first stone was laid down on the floor of that ancient sea. Let us sit here for a while, on the moss beside the spring, and let the hollow do what it does to everyone who enters it, which is to slow them down, to gentle them, to dissolve the urgency that the outside world insists upon, until what remains is only the present moment, this moss, this water, this air, this darkness that is not empty but full of the accumulated presence of 400 million years of rain and wind, and the slow, patient chemistry of stone dissolving and reforming, full of the roots that thread through the soil beneath us like a network of quiet conversations conducted in a language too low for human ears, full of the particular quality of attention that the forest pays to itself, the way each organism in this ecosystem is simultaneously listening and being listened to, the way the mycorrhizal networks beneath the leaf litter connect the roots of trees that are separated by hundreds of feet, sharing nutrients and chemical signals in a kind of communion that predates human consciousness by epochs. You can feel this network beneath you now, if you let yourself. If you allow your awareness to sink downward through the moss and into the soil, a vast interconnected web of life and slow intelligence that extends beneath the entire forest, beneath the entire mountain, beneath every ridgeline and every hollow from Georgia to Maine, holding it all together in a single living system so enormous and so ancient that to comprehend it would be like trying to comprehend the distance between stars. And so instead of comprehending it, we simply rest within it, the way a cell rests within a body, trusting the larger pattern even when we cannot see its edges. There is a sound now so low that it is almost beneath the threshold of hearing, a hum that seems to come not from any particular direction, but from the ground itself, from the bedrock beneath the soil, a vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. And this is the frequency that the search and rescue veterans speak of in their quiet, end-of-shift conversations, the frequency that makes the compass needle drift, and the chest tighten with something that is not quite anxiety and not quite longing, but partakes of both, a feeling that the old mountain people called being touched by the hollow. And they did not consider it a bad thing, but rather a sign that the mountain had noticed you, had acknowledged your presence the way a vast sleeping animal might acknowledge the presence of a small bird that has alighted on its back, not with alarm or even interest exactly, but with a kind of deep ambient awareness that is older than thought, older than instinct, as old as the stone itself. The hum is steady and unchanging, and after a while you stop noticing it as a separate sound, and it becomes part of the texture of the silence, woven into the darkness and the cool air and the smell of wet stone, and you realize that it has probably been here the entire time. This low, patient vibration, this voice of the mountain speaking to itself in a register that only the very quiet can hear. A mist is forming now, rising from the creek and from the spring and from the countless tiny seeps and trickles that lace the hillside, and it moves through the hollow with a deliberateness that makes it seem almost alive, curling around the trunks of the hemlocks, pooling in the low places, flowing along the creek bank like a slow white river of air. The mist is cool where it touches your skin, cool and impossibly soft, and each droplet carries within it the faintest trace of all the minerals and organic compounds it has gathered in its passage through the air, the pollen of wildflowers that bloomed and faded months ago, the spores of fungi that have been breaking down fallen logs for decades, the microscopic fragments of leaves and bark and stone that the wind has been abrading from the surface of the mountain since before any human being walked this hollow, so that to feel the mist on your face is to be touched by a kind of condensed history, a physical expression of all the countless patient processes that have been at work in this place since the beginning. And as the mist thickens, the hollow draws closer around us, the visible world contracting to the nearest few feet. And there's a deep comfort in this contraction, a safety, in being held within a space so intimate and so enclosed, like being wrapped in a blanket woven from the mountain's own exhalation. In the deeper parts of these mountains, in the hollows where the cartographer's lines waver and thin, there are said to be places where time itself moves differently, not faster or slower in any way that could be measured by a clock, but denser somehow, heavier, as though the accumulated years have given time a weight that you can feel pressing gently against your consciousness, slowing your thoughts the way deep water slows a current. And perhaps this is what the lost hikers feel when the search and rescue teams find them sitting quietly beside a stream or leaning against the trunk of an old chestnut oak, that quality of settledness, that strange peace, as though they have been submerged in a time that is not measured in minutes or hours, but in the turning of seasons and the slow erosion of stone and the patient, imperceptible drift of the continental plates. And in that immersion, the urgencies of ordinary human time have simply dissolved the way salt dissolves in water, leaving nothing behind but a faint taste, a faint memory of hurrying, of needing to be somewhere, and the immense relief of discovering that there is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, only this hollow, this darkness, this ancient, unhurried now. Far above us, above the canopy and the mist and the dark bulk of the ridgeline, the stars are emerging one by one in the deepening sky, and from this hollow they are visible only as the faintest points of light glimpsed through gaps in the leaves. But even so, they carry with them the same quality of patient, unhurried presence that characterizes everything in this place, because the light that is reaching your eyes from those stars began its journey thousands of years ago. Thousands of years before any of the trees in this hollow were seedlings, thousands of years before the laurel hells had grown into their current impenetrable density, and it has been traveling all that time through the vast, cold spaces between worlds, traveling at the fastest speed the universe permits, and yet arriving here with such gentleness, such softness, that it is barely distinguishable from the darkness it illuminates. This is the scale at which the mountains exist, the scale of deep time and stellar distance. And when you allow your awareness to expand to meet that scale, when you let go of the human measure and simply rest in the enormity of what is, something in you opens, some tightly held knot of worry or wakefulness loosens and releases, and you feel yourself becoming continuous with the darkness, with the mist, with the slow pulse of the spring and the low hum of the bedrock and the ancient, unhurried turning of the earth beneath you. Let us move now, slowly, along the creek bank, following the water downstream through the narrowing hollow, and as we walk, the rhododendron closes in again on either side, not as densely as before, but close enough that the branches brush our shoulders with their cool, waxy leaves. And the sound of the water changes as the creek bed drops and the current quickens, the individual voices of the riffles and the small falls blending into a continuous murmur that is almost, but not quite, like speech, as though the water were telling a story that it has been telling for millions of years, a story with no beginning and no end, only an eternal middle, an eternal unfolding of the same few themes, the wearing away of stone, the filling and emptying of pools. The way the current finds and loses and finds again the path of least resistance through the jumbled boulders that have fallen from the cliffs above and lodged themselves in the creek bed like the scattered pieces of some impossibly large and ancient puzzle. Your feet find their way along the bank without much guidance from your eyes, because the path here has been worn so smooth and so deep by generations of passage that your body can follow it by feel alone, the way a river follows its bed. And there's a pleasure in this, a pleasure in surrendering to the path, in letting the body navigate while the mind drifts and loosens and grows soft. The hollow widens here, briefly, and the creek spreads out over a broad, flat ledge of sandstone that is exposed to the sky. And on this ledge, the water is only an inch or two deep, flowing in a thin, glassy sheet that reflects whatever light remains in the sky above, so that walking across it would be like walking across a mirror laid flat on the surface of the earth, a mirror that shows not your reflection, but the reflection of the clouds and the first stars, and the dark silhouettes of the hemlocks that line the bank. And the whole scene has a quality of stillness and transparency that makes it seem less like a real place and more like the memory of a place or the dream of one, as though the hollow were showing us not what it is but what it has been, across all the uncountable nights when this same water flowed over this same stone, beneath this same slowly turning sky. There are fossils in this sandstone, the preserved impressions of creatures that lived in that ancient sea, brachiopods and crinoids, and the delicate fan-shaped fronds of bryozoans. And if you kneel beside the ledge and run your fingers over the stone, you can feel their shapes beneath the water, the slight ridge of a shell, the spiral of a crinoid stem. And to touch them is to touch something that existed 400 million years ago, to make contact across an abyss of time so vast that the mind cannot hold it, can only stand at its edge and feel the vertigo of deep time, and then, gently, step back from the edge and let the feeling settle into something quieter, something more like awe, more like the deep, restful wonder of knowing that you are part of something immeasurably old and immeasurably large, and that this something, whatever it is, has been holding you all along. Beyond the sandstone ledge, the hollow narrows again, and the walls of the ridge close in on either side until the creek runs through a passage barely wider than a hallway, the rock walls rising 20, 30, 40 feet on either side, dark and wet and feathered with ferns that grow from every crack and crevice, their fronds uncurling in the permanent dampness like small green hands reaching for something they will never quite touch. The sound of the water in this narrow passage is amplified and transformed, bouncing off the rock walls and returning to itself in overlapping echoes that create a complex shifting pattern of sound, a kind of natural music that is neither melodic nor rhythmic in any conventional sense, but that has its own deep structure, its own internal logic, a logic governed not by human aesthetics, but by the geometry of the stone and the volume and velocity of the water and the particular way that sound waves interact when they meet in a confined space. And if you close your eyes and simply listen, simply let the sound wash over you without trying to analyze or categorize it, you will find that it produces a state of mind that is very much like the state that precedes sleep, that liminal zone where thought loses its sharpness and begins to blur at the edges, where images arise and dissolve without any conscious direction, where the boundary between self and world grows thin and permeable, and the body begins to feel like something you are wearing rather than something you are. On the far side of this narrow passage, the hollow opens into what the mountain people call a cove, a broad, bowl-shaped depression in the mountainside that is sheltered on three sides by steep ridges and open on the fourth to the south, where the creek continues its patient descent toward the valley below, and the cove is filled with the oldest, tallest trees in the forest, tulip poplars so massive that their trunks are like the columns of some natural cathedral, their canopy so high that looking up into it is like looking into the vaulted ceiling of a cave, dark and vast and arching away into distances that the eye cannot reliably measure. The forest floor in the cove is remarkably open, almost park-like in its spaciousness, because the canopy above is so dense that very little light reaches the ground, and so the understory is sparse, just a few scattered patches of fern and the occasional ghostly stalk of an Indian pipe or a beech drops, parasitic plants that have given up on light entirely and draw their sustenance instead from the roots of the trees around them, tapping into that vast underground network of shared resources that connects every living thing in this forest to every other living thing. A network that is, in its own way, a kind of consciousness, a distributed intelligence that has been managing the health and balance of this ecosystem for millennia without the need for any central authority, any plan, any intention, only the slow, recursive wisdom of systems that have had 400 million years to refine themselves. The mist has followed us into the cove, pooling among the great trunks like a lake of white air. And above the mist, the canopy is barely visible, just a dark suggestion of branches and leaves. And above that, through the gaps, the stars, brighter now than they were before, burning with a cold, clean light that seems to intensify the silence rather than disturb it, the way a single note on a piano can make the silence that follows it seem deeper and more complete. There is a fallen log at the edge of the cove, a massive tulip poplar that came down in some storm decades ago and has been slowly returning to the earth ever since, its bark long since shed, its heartwood soft and crumbling, its surface covered with a thick pelt of moss and lichens and tiny, delicate mushrooms, that glow with a faint phosphorescence in the darkness, emitting a light so subtle that you cannot see it if you look directly at it, but only if you look slightly to the side, the way you must look at the faintest stars, and this soft, oblique light gives the fallen log an otherworldly quality, as though it exists not just in this hollow, but in some adjacent reality, some parallel forest, where the trees give off their own light, and the boundaries between living and dead, between plant and stone, between earth and sky, have dissolved into a single, continuous luminescence. Let us rest here on this log, on the soft moss that covers it like a blanket laid down by some attentive, invisible hand, and let us listen to the cove as it settles into full darkness, because the sounds of the cove at night are different from the sounds of the hollow we pass through, deeper and more resonant, as though the bowl-shaped depression in the mountainside acts as a natural amphitheater, gathering and focusing the tiny sounds of the forest into something richer and more coherent. There is the creek, of course, its voice muted here by distance but still present, a continuous undertone like the sound of breath, like the sound of your own blood moving through your body, rhythmic and steady and so constant that after a while you stop hearing it as a separate sound and it becomes part of your own interior silence. There is the occasional call of a barred owl from somewhere on the ridgeline, that deep, resonant who cooks for you that carries through the forest with a clarity that seems almost supernatural, as though the sound were traveling not through air but through the wood of the trees themselves, transmitted from trunk to trunk the way a vibration travels through a tuning fork. And each time the owl calls, the forest seems to pause and listen, a brief, held breath of attention before the background murmur of insects and water and wind resumes. There is, too, the sound that the search and rescue veterans speak of, that low-frequency hum that lives just beneath the threshold of hearing. And here in the cove, it is stronger than it was by the spring, not louder exactly, but more present, more insistent, as though the bedrock beneath the cove is resonating at some frequency that corresponds to something deep in the architecture of the human body, something in the bones or the fluid of the inner ear or the electrical rhythms of the brain itself. And this resonance produces a feeling that is difficult to describe in words, but that you will recognize instantly if you allow yourself to feel it, a feeling of being simultaneously very small and very safe, like a child held against the chest of a sleeping parent, able to feel the enormous slow rhythm of the parent's heartbeat, and knowing, without needing to think about it, that this rhythm will continue through the night, steady and reliable and ancient, the oldest rhythm there is. The rhythm of something that does not need to be understood in order to be trusted. This is what the hollow offers. This is what the mountain gives to those who come to it quietly and without demands. This deep preverbal assurance that you are held, that you have always been held, that the holding will continue long after you have let go of everything else. A woman who grew up in one of the last inhabited hollows in this part of the mountains, a hollow so remote that the mail carrier came only once a week, and the nearest paved road was a 2-hour walk along a creek bed, once said that the mountain has a mind of its own, slow and patient and deep, and that if you live close enough to it for long enough, you can begin to feel it thinking, the way you can feel the seasons changing. Weeks before the calendar confirms it, a subtle shift in the quality of the light, a barely perceptible change in the temperature of the spring water, a difference in the way the birds sing at dusk that tells you something large and slow is turning, some great wheel that governs not just the weather, but the mood of the forest itself. And she said this sitting on her porch in the blue twilight with a mason jar of cold spring water in her hand, looking out at the ridgeline that had been her horizon for 70 years, and her voice had the same quality as the hollow itself, unhurried, deep, worn smooth by decades of use the way the sandstone is worn smooth by the water. And when she finished speaking, there was a long silence, and in that silence you could hear everything she meant, all the accumulated years and seasons and quiet days, all the mornings of mist and evenings of stars, held in the shape of what she did not say. The night deepens, and with it, the cove deepens too, the darkness becoming more complete, more textured, more dimensional, until the darkness itself seems to be the primary substance of the world, and everything else, the trees, The moss, the fallen log, your own body, seems to be merely temporary shapes that the darkness has agreed to hold for a while before reclaiming them. The way the ocean holds the shape of a wave before the wave dissolves back into the general movement of the water. And there is nothing frightening about this thought, because the darkness here is not absence, but presence, not emptiness, but fullness, a fullness so complete that it needs no light to reveal it, no sound to confirm it, only the quiet attention of someone who has grown still enough to feel it, and you are growing still now. You have been growing still since we entered the hollow. Each step, each breath, each moment of listening has been wearing away the restlessness of the day, the way the water wears away the stone, patiently, unhurriedly, until what remains is only this stillness, this darkness, this deep settled sense of being exactly where you are supposed to be. The mountains hold you now the way they hold the mist, the way they hold the fossils in the sandstone, the way they hold the memory of every season that has ever passed through these hollows, gently, completely, without any effort, because holding is what they do, it is what they have always done, and they will go on doing it long after everything else has changed. Far to the south, beyond the ridgeline that forms the southern wall of the cove, there are other hollows, other zones marked with small red circles on the search and rescue maps, hollows where the laurel grows so thick that no path has ever been cut through it, where springs rise from the ground at temperatures that do not correspond to any known geothermal activity, where hikers who wander off the trail and into the deep forest report hearing what sounds like distant singing, a wordless melody carried on a frequency just at the edge of audibility. And when asked to describe the singing, they invariably say the same thing, that it sounded old, that it sounded like something the mountain itself was remembering, not with the mind, but with the stone, the way a bell remembers the shape of the sound it was cast to make. We will not enter those hollows tonight. We will only know that they are there, that they exist beyond the horizon of our waking awareness, the way dreams exist beyond the horizon of our waking thoughts, present but unreachable, except through surrender, except through the gentle, willing dissolution of everything we think we know about where we are and who we are, and what the darkness holds. The barred owl calls again, closer now, and you can hear the slight rasp at the beginning of each syllable, the physical effort of pushing that much sound through that small a body, and the call settles over the cove like a blanket, warm and heavy and impossibly soft, and in its wake, the silence seems to deepen by another degree, as though the owl's voice has opened a door into a quieter room. Within the silence, a room you did not know was there until you heard it open, and now you are inside it. And the walls of this room are made of darkness and moss and the slow exhalation of the mountain, and the floor is made of 400 million years of accumulated time compressed into a surface so smooth and so solid that you could rest on it forever, that you could let your weight sink into it completely and know that it would hold you, that it has been holding everything that has ever lived in these mountains, every leaf and every creature and every drop of water and every grain of stone. Holding it all in a single, continuous embrace that does not waver, does not falter, does not forget. Your body is heavy now, heavy with the accumulated stillness of the hollow, heavy with the mist that has settled on your skin and your clothes, heavy with the particular gravity that this place exerts on everything that enters it, a gravity that is not physical but temporal, the weight of deep time pressing gently against your consciousness, slowing your thoughts, deepening your breath, drawing you down into a state that is not quite sleep but not quite waking either, that liminal territory where the mind moves freely between the real and the imagined, between the present and the ancient, between the self and the forest. And in this territory there are no boundaries, no edges, no distinctions, only a vast continuous field of awareness that extends in every direction, encompassing the cove and the hollow and the ridgeline and the mist and the stars and the ancient stone and the water flowing over it, all of it held in a single moment that is also 400 million years. All of it resting in the darkness that is also light, all of it supported by a silence that is also the most profound and encompassing sound you have ever heard. There is a particular quality to the air in these deep hollows just before the body surrenders to sleep, a quality that the old mountain people would have recognized instantly, but that we, having come from the world of artificial light and constant noise, might need a moment to identify, and it is this. The air seems thicker, not with humidity or particulate, but with presence, as though the hollow itself has drawn closer around us, has contracted to exactly the size needed to contain this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, and nothing more. And within this intimate, precise enclosure, everything that was distant has become near. The stars are just above the canopy. The bedrock is just beneath the moss. The past is just behind the present, separated by a membrane so thin that you can almost see through it, can almost make out the shapes of the ancient sea creatures moving through the water that once covered this very spot. Can almost hear the sound of rain falling on mountains that were young and sharp and impossibly high. Mountains that have been wearing down toward this moment, toward this particular configuration of stone and tree and water and darkness for longer than the human mind can comprehend. And yet here it is. Here you are, resting at the still point of all that immeasurable change. The hermit thrush has fallen silent now, and the owl and even the creek has grown quiet in the way that creeks do in the deepest hours of the night, when the air temperature drops and the water slows, and the whole forest enters a state of such profound rest that even the metabolic processes of the trees slow down, the sap moving more slowly through the cambium, the roots drawing less water from the soil, the leaves releasing their last stored warmth into the cool air in tiny infrared exhalations that no human eye can see, but that a different kind of eye, an eye calibrated to longer wavelengths, would perceive as a soft, ghostly glow hovering around every branch and every trunk, a halo of biological heat being surrendered to the night, and this surrender is not defeat, but completion. The completion of a cycle that began with the first light of dawn and will begin again with the next. A cycle as old and as reliable as the turning of the earth itself. And within this cycle, there is no urgency, no deadline, no consequence to letting go, only the deep instinctive wisdom of knowing when to cease, when to rest, when to allow the darkness to do its quiet, restorative work. You are part of this cycle now. Your breathing has synchronized with the slow rhythm of the hollow. Your heartbeat has found its place within the larger pattern of sounds and silences that make up the nighttime forest. And the boundary between your body and the moss you rest upon has grown soft and indistinct, as though the moss were absorbing you the way it absorbs the mist, gently, molecule by molecule, drawing you into the living fabric of the forest itself. And this absorption is not loss but homecoming, a return to something you have always been part of but had temporarily forgotten in the noise and brightness of the waking world. The hollow knows this, the mountain knows this, the ancient stone beneath the soil knows this, because they have been receiving the weary and the lost for millennia, drawing them in, gentling them, holding them in the particular quality of silence that exists only in the deepest, most remote places on earth, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that does not need to be said, everything that can only be communicated through the slow language of stone and water and the patient, unhurried passage of time. And now, as the mist thickens and the darkness deepens and the last faint traces of the waking world dissolve like breath in cold air, let us release even the effort of listening, even the gentle attention we have been paying to the sounds and textures of the hollow, and let the hollow itself do the remaining work, the work of carrying you from here to wherever it is that sleep resides in its deepest and most restorative form, that place beyond dreams and beyond waking, that place where the mind rests the way the fossils rest in the sandstone, cradled in something so much larger and so much older than itself that the question of safety does not arise, has never arisen, because in the embrace of something that vast there is no room for doubt, only the infinite patient reassurance of deep time, of ancient stone, of water that has been flowing over these mountains since before the first creature crawled onto land, and will continue flowing long after the last stars burn to embers, and the universe itself has grown quiet, and still, and dark. The mountains hold you now, and the mountains are old, and the mountains are patient, and the mountains do not let go of what they hold, and what they hold is everything, every leaf and every stone and every drop of rain and every breath of wind and every moment of every night that has ever settled over these ridgelines, held in the deep, capacious memory of the earth itself. And you are part of that memory now, not as something added, but as something that was always there, always waiting to be recognized, the way a fossil waits in the stone, the way a spring waits in the bedrock, the way sleep waits in the body of someone who is finally, after all the walking and all the listening and all the gentle accumulation of stillness, allowed themselves to rest. The creek whispers, the mist settles, the mountain hums its low ancient note, and the hollow that the cartographers could not quite map and the search and rescue teams could not quite explain, enfolds you in the same darkness that enfolds the hemlocks and the rhododendron and the sandstone and the fossils and the spring. The darkness that is not the end of anything but the beginning of the deepest rest, the most profound quiet, the most complete and unhurried peace. And in this darkness there is nothing left to do, nothing left to know, nothing left to hold on to, only the slow, sweet gravity of sleep pulling you down through the layers of thought and memory and wakefulness, the way the water pulls itself down through the layers of stone, finding the path of least resistance, following the ancient channels, descending toward some deep, hidden reservoir of stillness that has been waiting for you all along, patient and full and absolutely, immeasurably safe. The stars turn slowly above the hollow, tracing their ancient circuits across a sky that the mountains have been watching for 400 million years, and the mist rises and falls with the breathing of the creek, and the owl settles into the crook of an old hemlock and tucks its head beneath its wing. And somewhere deep in the laurel hell, a spring seeps quietly from the bedrock, adding its tiny, patient voice to the collective murmur of the mountain. And all of these things continue as they have always continued, without effort, without intention, without any consciousness of the passage of time, and you continue with them, held in the same pattern, resting in the same ancient rhythm, your breath rising and falling like the mist, your heartbeat steady and slow as the pulse of the spring, your thoughts dissolving one by one like stones worn smooth by water, growing smaller and rounder and lighter until they are barely there at all. Just the faintest impressions on the surface of your awareness, and then even these impressions fade, and what remains is only the hollow, only the mountain, only the deep encompassing darkness that has been waiting for you since before you were born, since before anyone was born, since the first stone was laid down on the floor of that ancient sea, and it holds you now with the same tenderness it has held everything else, holds you as though you were the most natural thing in the world. As though you had always been here, resting in the oldest mountains on earth, in the deepest hollow, in the most ancient and most peaceful darkness, asleep, at last completely, finally, and forever asleep in the arms of the patient, unhurried, immeasurable earth. There is a place where the old wagon roads end, not with any marker or signpost or deliberate boundary, with a slow narrowing of the ruts until they become indistinguishable from the deer trails, and the deer trails themselves thin to nothing more than the faintest suggestion of passage through the rhododendron thickets, a whisper of bent stems and compressed moss that even the most experienced tracker would lose within a dozen paces. And it is here, at this vanishing point where human intention dissolves into the immensity of the forest's own geometry, that we begin tonight, settling into the soft darkness the way a stone settles into the silt of a creek bed, slowly, with infinite patience, finding the precise contour of rest that has been waiting for it since the water first began to flow. The air here carries a coolness that does not sting but rather envelops, a temperature so perfectly balanced between warmth and chill that it seems to erase the boundary between your skin and the night itself. And within that coolness there rides the scent of wet sandstone, of fungal threads working silently through the heartwood of fallen chestnuts, of the particular earthy sweetness that rises when fog presses itself against a hillside of decaying leaves that have been accumulating, layer upon layer, for longer than the oldest cabin foundation in these hills has held its stones together. Let yourself be here now, in this place where the roads remember nothing and the trees remember everything, where the darkness is not an absence, but a presence as tangible and as tender as a hand resting lightly on your chest, and know that the mountains themselves are holding this moment the way a cupped palm holds water, gently, without grasping, offering it to the long, slow turning of the earth. There's a woman named Arlene who lives alone at the end of a gravel track in Madison County, North Carolina, in a house whose poplar log walls have been settling into the hillside since her great-great-grandmother carried the first iron kettle up the switchback trail from the valley below. And on certain evenings, when the barometric pressure drops and the clouds descend to wrap the ridgeline like gauze around a sleeping forehead, she will sit on the porch with a cup of sassafras tea and listen to the hollow fill with the particular quality of quiet that she says has a color to it, a deep indigo that you can almost see pooling in the lowest parts of the cove, the way cold air pools, the way water pools, the way silence itself gathers in the places where the mountain has curved inward, to create a sheltered space that the wind cannot reach and the modern world has never found reason to name. She told a folklorist once, in the unhurried cadence of someone who measures time by the blooming of trillium and the return of the wood thrush rather than by any clock, that the forest beyond her fence line is not empty but full, so full that it has no room for noise, so full that sound enters it the way a single drop of rain enters the ocean and is immediately, peacefully, absorbed into something so much larger than itself that the very concept of separateness ceases to apply. And when she finishes her tea and the last light has gone from the sky, and the indigo silence has risen past the porch railing to touch the hem of her skirt, she closes her eyes and breathes with the mountain in and out, slowly, the way these old hills have been breathing since long before the first human voice ever called them home, since the time when they stood taller than the Himalayas and have been slowly, gracefully, settling into their own ancient softness ever since. The search and rescue volunteers who work the trails of the Pisgah and Nantahala forests carry with them a knowledge that is rarely written down, but passes instead through long evenings at base camp, through the quiet exchange of observations offered in the same tone one might use to describe the habits of a river or the preferences of the wind. And among this knowledge is an understanding that there are certain coves and certain draws and certain stretches of old-growth forest where the usual rules of navigation become unreliable, not in any dangerous or threatening way, but in the manner of a dream in which the hallway you are walking down is always slightly longer than you remembered. The door always a few more steps ahead, the distance between where you are and where you intended to be stretching with a gentle elasticity that suggests the landscape itself is breathing, expanding and contracting with a rhythm too slow for any instrument to measure, but perceptible, nonetheless, to anyone who has spent enough nights sleeping on the ground, with their ear pressed to the leaf litter and the deep rock beneath. One retired ranger, a man named Curtis, who speaks with the deliberation of someone choosing each word the way a stonemason chooses each stone, described it as walking into a room that is larger on the inside than the outside, a place where the compass needle drifts not because of any magnetic anomaly, but because direction itself has become a softer concept, a suggestion rather than a command, and where the impulse to continue forward is replaced by an equally compelling impulse to simply stop, to sit down on the nearest fallen log, to let the moss accept the weight of your body, and the canopy accept the weight of your thoughts, and the silence accept the weight of every sound you have ever carried with you. These places are marked on no official map, but they exist in the collective memory of every person who has walked far enough into these mountains to feel the moment when the forest shifts from something you are moving through to something you are held within, a transition as subtle and as irreversible as the moment between waking and sleep, when the world you have been holding together with your attention gently, mercifully, lets itself go. The fog that rises from the creek bottoms of the southern Appalachians is not like fog anywhere else on earth. And this is not merely a poetic assertion, but a consequence of the extraordinary age of these watersheds, which have been carving their channels through the same folded strata of gneiss and schist and ancient metamorphic stone for so many millions of years that the water itself seems to carry a kind of memory, a mineral patience that infuses the mist with a weight and a texture that you can feel against your face like the softest cloth ever woven. like the breath of something so large and so old that its exhalations take centuries to complete. Tonight, the fog is moving up the hollow with the slow deliberation of a tide, filling the spaces between the tulip poplars and the white oaks and the hemlocks whose lowest branches drip with a moisture that predates any rain, that seems to condense directly from the air's own ancient longing to return to the liquid state from which it was born. And as you watch it rise, or rather, as you feel it rise, because watching implies a separation that the fog does not permit, you notice that the boundary between the seen and the unseen is not a line but a gradient, a slow dissolving of edges and outlines and the hard certainties of daylight into something softer, something more forgiving, something that asks nothing of you except that you let go of the need to see clearly and allow yourself to be held in the gentle blindness of the cloud. The mountain breathes, and the fog is its breath, and you are breathing it too now, drawing into your lungs the same moisture that has been cycling through these hollows since the Appalachians were young, since they rose sharp and jagged from the collision of ancient continents, and then began their long, patient surrender to gravity and rain and the tender, ceaseless work of roots and lichens and the passage of time itself, which moves through these coves not as a river, but as a fog, soft and directionless and everywhere at once. In the deep coves where the canopy closes so completely that even midday carries a quality of perpetual dusk, the forest floor develops a texture unlike anything found in the younger, thinner woods of the surrounding ridges, a carpet of moss and decomposing leaves and fallen hemlock needles, so thick and so soft that walking across it produces no sound whatsoever, as though the ground itself has learned the art of absorbing not just footfalls, but all vibration, all disturbance, drawing everything down into its layered darkness, the way a blanket draws warmth into its folds and holds it there against the long patience of the night. Curtis, the retired ranger, told a story once about spending 3 days alone in one of these coves during a search that had been quietly, without any official announcement, scaled back and then discontinued. And he said that by the second night, he had stopped looking for the person he had been sent to find, and had begun instead to simply listen, not for any particular sound, but for the shape of the silence itself, which he described as having architecture, having rooms and hallways and vaulted ceilings like a cathedral built entirely from the accumulated weight of undisturbed time. He said he was not frightened, and when he said this there was no bravado in his voice, only the calm certainty of someone describing a physical sensation as unremarkable as the warmth of the sun, because the silence in that cove was not the silence of absence or threat, but the silence of completion, the silence that exists at the center of something that has been growing and deepening and folding in upon itself for 400 million years. A silence so full and so finished that it had no need of anything, least of all the small temporary noises of a single human being sitting on a log in the dark, breathing slowly, feeling himself dissolve by gentle degrees into the vast and unhurried dream of the forest. There is a particular species of salamander that exists only in these mountains, a creature so small and so perfectly adapted to the darkness of the spaces beneath stones and fallen logs that its skin is nearly translucent, and if you were to hold one in your palm, which no one does because they are rarely found and even more rarely touched, you would see through the delicate membrane of its body the slow pulse of its heart, the faintest pink rhythm beating with such gentleness that it seems less like a biological function than a form of listening, as though the creature is keeping time with some deeper pulse that rises from the rock itself, from the slow tectonic heartbeat of the mountain that has been thrumming beneath these ridges since the plates of the earth first pressed themselves together in the unimaginable heat of deep geological time. These salamanders are counted among the rarest beings on the planet, but in the coves and dead zones where the rangers do not go, they are as common as the leaves, as common as the water droplets that form on the undersides of rhododendron leaves and hang there, trembling, catching whatever faint light filters down through the canopy in a glow that is neither gold nor silver, but something in between, something that has no name in any human language, because it exists only here, only in this particular intersection of moisture and shadow and the ancient patient light that has been finding its way into these hollows since before the first eye evolved to see it. And the salamander does not see it either, but feels it, the way you feel the warmth of a thought that comes to you just before sleep, a thought that has no words and no edges and no urgency, a thought that simply arrives and settles and becomes part of the quiet landscape of your drifting mind, as natural and as inevitable as the mist that rises, as the leaves that fall, as the mountains that have been slowly, peacefully returning to the earth from which they rose. Arlene speaks of the draw the way other people speak of weather, as something so familiar and so woven into the fabric of daily life that it requires no explanation and no alarm, only acknowledgement, the way one acknowledges the direction of the wind or the particular shade of gray that the sky turns before the first snow of November. And she says that the draw is strongest in the hours just after midnight, when the last ember in the wood stove has gone from orange to gray, and the house itself seems to exhale, settling deeper into its foundation of river stones with a series of small creaks and sighs that she's been listening to for so many decades that they have become a kind of language, a conversation between the structure that shelters her and the hillside that holds it, a negotiation between the human desire for permanence and the mountain's infinite, unhurried patience. She says that on those nights she can feel the forest leaning toward her, not with menace, but with a kind of gravitational tenderness, the way a sleeping child leans toward the warmth of a parent's body without waking, drawn by something deeper than intention, something woven into the very fabric of proximity and warmth, and the ancient mammalian understanding that closeness is safety and stillness is rest. And she says that she has learned, over the course of a lifetime spent at the edge of these unnamed coves, to lean back, to let her awareness drift outward past the porch railing and into the indigo dark, past the fence line and into the rhododendron thickets where the fog is pooling like something poured from a vessel of infinite capacity, past the last recognizable landmark and into the deep unmapped interior of the mountain's own dreaming, where all the lost trails and abandoned home sites and forgotten names and uncounted seasons of leaf fall have been gathered and held, and slowly, gently, absorbed into the soft, dark, breathing body of the earth. The creek that runs through the bottom of every Appalachian hollow has a voice that changes with the hour and the season and the particular quality of attention that the listener brings to it. And tonight it is speaking in the register it reserves for the deepest hours. A low, continuous murmur that is less like the sound of water over stone than like the sound of stone remembering water. A sound that seems to rise not from the surface of the creek, but from somewhere far below, from the hidden aquifers and underground channels where water that fell as rain 1,000 years ago is still making its slow, lightless journey through the bedrock, finding its way by touch alone through fissures no wider than a fingertip, guided by nothing but the patient, inexorable pull of gravity and the molecular memory of the path that every drop before it has followed since the mountain was young. If you close your eyes and listen, and you may close your eyes now, if they are not already closed, because there is nothing here that requires seeing, nothing that the darkness cannot deliver more gently than the light, you will notice that the creek's voice has a rhythm to it, not the predictable rhythm of a machine, but the organic, breathing rhythm of a living system. A rhythm that slows and deepens as the night wears on, as the temperature drops by imperceptible degrees and the fog thickens, and the boundary between the water and the air and the stone and the silence becomes so soft, so permeable, that they begin to merge into a single substance, a single continuous presence that has been flowing through this hollow since the continent was whole, and the ocean was warm, and the first fern uncurled its frond in the shadow of a mountain that no longer exists, except as a memory held in the pattern of the stone. You are part of this rhythm now, your breathing synchronized with the creek's murmur and the mountain's exhalation and the slow turning of the earth through the star-filled dark. And there's nothing to do and nowhere to go and nothing to figure out, only this, only the sound of ancient water finding its ancient way through the ancient rock, carrying you with it, deeper, slower, down into the soft, layered silence of the cove. The trees in these dead zones, and the word dead is misleading, because these are the most alive places in the eastern mountains, places where the biomass per acre exceeds that of many tropical rainforests, where every surface is covered with something growing and every cubic inch of soil contains more living organisms than there are stars visible to the naked eye. The trees in these places grow in ways that the trees of managed forests do not, their trunks twisted into spirals by the slow rotation of their reaching toward whatever fragments of light filter down through the canopy above. Their bark furrowed so deeply that the grooves become miniature ecosystems of their own, hosting mosses and lichens and tiny ferns and beetles, so small they are visible only as points of iridescent color moving with incomprehensible slowness across the gray-green landscape of the bark, each one carrying within its minuscule body the same ancient instruction that drives the creek and the fog and the mountain itself. Persist, continue, find the path, let time do its work. And the roots of these trees extend not just downward into the soil, but outward, interweaving with the roots of their neighbors in a network so dense and so interconnected that the forest floor is essentially a single organism, a web of shared resources and chemical signals and slow subterranean conversations that have been ongoing for centuries. And when one tree falls, as all trees eventually fall, surrendering to the same gravity that is slowly bringing the mountains themselves back to the level of the sea, the others receive its weight and its nutrients and its memory into their own bodies, incorporating its substance into their own growth, so that nothing is ever truly lost in these coves, nothing ever disappears. Everything is simply absorbed and transformed and carried forward into the next century and the next millennium and the next geological age, which is, perhaps, the deepest comfort these mountains have to offer, the knowledge that in this ancient place, letting go is not an ending but a becoming, not a loss but a return to the vast, living, breathing whole from which everything emerges and to which everything, in its own time, gently and without resistance, goes home. There are nights in these hollows when the stars are visible through gaps in the canopy. And on those nights, the retired rangers say the forest takes on a different character, not brighter exactly, but more translucent, as though the darkness itself has thinned just enough to reveal the suggestion of structure within it. The vaulted architecture of interlocking branches overhead, the pale columns of birch trunks rising from the dark floor like pillars in a temple whose builders have long since been forgotten, the silver threads of spider silk catching starlight in brief trembling arcs that connect one shadow to the next in a geometry too complex and too ephemeral for any map to hold. On such a night you might see, if your eyes have adjusted fully and your mind has slowed to the pace of the fog and the creek and the salamander's pulse, the way the forest breathes with the starlight, the canopy expanding and contracting with a movement so gradual that it could be the breathing of the mountain itself, or the slow heaving of the tectonic plates far below, or the expansion of the universe made visible at the intimate scale of a single hemlock branch, lifting and falling in a rhythm measured not in seconds but in hours, a rhythm that has been repeating since the first star cast its light on these ancient stones. And you are beneath that canopy now, wrapped in the cool air and the scent of galax and the sound of the creek's low murmur and the weight of the darkness that is not empty but full, fuller than any room you have ever entered, full of the accumulated presence of every creature that has ever sheltered here, and every season that has ever turned here, and every drop of rain that has ever fallen here and been drawn down through the leaf litter and the soil and the fractured rock to join the slow, hidden river that flows beneath everything, the underground current that connects this hollow to every other hollow, this mountain to every other mountain, this moment to every other moment in the long, unbroken history of the sleeping earth. Curtis told the folklorist a story about a night in the Shining Rock wilderness, when his compass had drifted and his radio had gone quiet, not dead, he emphasized, but quiet, as though the signal had simply decided to lie down and rest, the way a tired animal lies down, without drama or distress, simply yielding to the pull of exhaustion and the promise of stillness. And he had found himself in a cove he had never seen before, though he had been walking these mountains for 37 years, a cove so deep and so enclosed that the sky above was reduced to a narrow, irregular aperture through which he could see exactly 7 stars, and he sat down on a log that was so thoroughly colonized by moss that it felt less like wood than like a living cushion designed specifically for the purpose of holding him in that moment, in that place. And he said that what he felt was not fear, but recognition, the sudden, overwhelming sense that he had been in this place before, not in any previous lifetime or mystical sense, but in the way that every human being has been in this place before, because this is where we all come from. This is what the world was before we began to name it and measure it and light it up. This is the original darkness, the first silence, the cradle from which consciousness itself emerged and to which it longs in its quietest moments to return. He sat there for what he believed was several hours, though time in these coves behaves the way water behaves in a pool with no outlet, circling slowly back upon itself. And when he finally stood and walked out, guided not by his compass or his training, but by something he could only describe as a feeling of being gently released, the way a hand opens to let a held thing go, he emerged on a ridge he recognized, under a sky full of stars, and he knew that he had been held, not trapped, but held, the way the mountain holds its springs and its stories and its silence, with a tenderness that requires no explanation, because it is older than language, older than thought, older than the very concept of safety. And yet it is safety itself, the original safety, the deep and abiding assurance that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, in the hollows where the hemlocks grow thickest, where their roots have knitted together over centuries into a lattice so dense that the soil beneath them never fully dries even in the deepest drought of August. There's a quality of warmth that defies the expectations of anyone accustomed to associating dense forest shade with cold, a warmth that seems to emanate not from the air or the ground, but from the act of decomposition itself, from the slow chemical fire that burns endlessly in the layers of fallen needles and decomposing wood. A fire without flame or light that produces a heat so gentle you can feel it only when you place your hand flat against the forest floor and hold it there. Still, for a full minute, letting your palm become sensitive enough to register the faint, patient warmth rising from beneath, the warmth of the mountain's metabolism, the caloric signature of a process that has been running continuously for millennia and will continue running for millennia more. Long after every road and every town and every human story has been absorbed back into the leaf litter and the soil and the slow, dark, living warmth of the earth. This is the warmth that the salamanders seek, the warmth that the overwintering insects burrow toward, the warmth that the roots of the oldest trees have been drawing upon since before the American chestnut blight rewrote the composition of the canopy. And it is the warmth that you can feel now if you let yourself sink just a little deeper into the place where you are resting, letting the surface tensions of your body release one by one, the jaw, the shoulders, the hands, the muscles around the eyes that have been holding the shape of wakefulness without your permission, until you are lying not on top of the world but within it, cradled in its warmth, held in its slow combustion, part of the same process that turns the leaves to soil and the soil to stone, and the stone, eventually, over spans of time that make human history look like a single breath, back into the molten interior from which the mountains first arose. That unimaginable furnace of creation and dissolution that burns at the center of everything, patiently, endlessly, the original warmth from which all warmth descends. Arlene says that her grandmother used to call the dead zones the sleeping rooms, as though the forest were a house with many chambers, and these particular coves were the ones where the mountain went to rest. And this image has stayed with Arlene her entire life, because it matches so precisely her own experience of these places, the sense upon entering them that the air grows thicker and slower and more saturated with the quality she can only describe as peace, not the anxious peace of a ceasefire or the fragile peace of a held breath, but the deep geological peace of a process that has been unfolding without interruption since before any creature walked upright. A peace so fundamental and so complete that it predates the very conditions that make conflict possible. A peace that exists not because problems have been solved, but because in this place, at this depth of time, the concept of a problem has not yet been invented. She says her grandmother would sit at the edge of these coves and hum, not any particular melody, but a single sustained note, low and steady, that seemed to synchronize with some frequency already present in the air. And when the note was right, When it locked into the frequency of the place, you could feel the forest responding, not with any visible movement but with a deepening of the silence, a thickening of the stillness, as though the sleeping room had recognized the sound and drawn it inward the way it draws in the fog and the falling leaves and the starlight and every other thing that comes to rest within its borders. And Arlene hums that same note now, on nights when the fog is thick and the draw is strong, sitting on her porch with her empty cup and her closed eyes, and the note travels outward into the dark hollow and is received by the rhododendron thickets and the hemlock cathedral and the creek and the stone and the sleeping salamanders and the mycorrhizal web beneath the soil, received and held and woven into the fabric of a silence that has been deepening since before there were ears to hear it. A silence that is not the opposite of sound, but the completion of it, the place where all sounds eventually arrive and are at last, mercifully, allowed to rest. The geological surveys of these mountains reveal a story so vast and so unhurried that the human mind can approach it only sideways, the way one approaches sleep, not by striding directly toward it, but by letting the attention soften and blur until the boundary between thinking and dreaming becomes as permeable as the boundary between the fog and the creek. And the story the rocks tell is this: that these mountains were born from the collision of continents approximately 480 million years ago, when the landmass that would become Africa pressed itself against the landmass that would become North America, with a force and a slowness that is almost impossible to imagine, a pressure that lifted the sea floor and the ancient sediments and the bodies of creatures that had been dead for 100 million years before the mountains began to rise, lifting all of it into a range that once stood as tall as the modern Alps, a range of sharp peaks and deep valleys and glacial cirques, carved by ice and wind and the relentless downward pull of water, and that everything you see now, every rounded ridge, every soft hollow, every gentle slope covered with the patient green of moss and fern, is the result of those original mountains being slowly, lovingly worn down by time, reduced by rain and root and frost, and the quiet chemical conversations between water and mineral that have been going on without pause for nearly 500 million years, so that what remains is not a mountain range in the conventional sense, but a memory of a mountain range, a ghost made solid, a dream of stone that has been dreaming itself downward toward the earth for so long that it has become the very definition of patience, the very embodiment of the knowledge that all things, given enough time, return to softness. And you are lying in the palm of that softness now, cradled in the curve of a hollow that was once the summit of a peak higher than Everest, held in the gentle concavity of a landscape that has spent 400 million years learning how to hold things without gripping, how to let go without losing, how to be both ancient and utterly, perpetually new. The sounds of the deep cove change as the night progresses through its long middle passage, that stretch of hours between midnight and the first intimation of dawn, when time seems to lose its forward motion and pool instead in the low places, the way the fog pools and the silence pools, gathering in the hollows and the draws and the spaces between the trees with a density that makes movement feel unnecessary, that makes the very concept of progress seem like an artifact of a brighter, busier world that has no jurisdiction here. In this pooled time, you may hear, if you listen with the particular quality of attention that the forest rewards, an attention that is not focused but diffuse, not searching but receiving like a bowl set out to catch rain, the sound of a barred owl calling from somewhere so deep in the cove that the call arrives not as a sharp vocalization, but as a vibration, a low thrumming that enters through the chest rather than the ears, a sound that has been echoing through these hollows since the Pleistocene, since the glaciers that never quite reached this far south sent their cold breath down through the valleys and the hemlock forests, retreated to the deepest, warmest coves where their descendants still stand today, tending the same darkness, breathing the same fog, hosting the same salamanders, keeping the same ancient silence that the owl's call does not break but somehow deepens. The way a single stone dropped into a still pool does not disturb the water but reveals its depth, and the owl calls again. and the sound is softer now, as though the bird itself is settling deeper into the night, deeper into the branch that holds it, deeper into the dream of the forest that holds them all. The owl and the hemlock and the salamander, and the fog and the creek and the stone and you, held together in the cupped palm of the mountain, sleeping, breathing, infinite dark. There are stories among the old families of these hollows, stories passed down not in books, but in the cadence of voices speaking low on porches in the last light of October evenings, stories about people who walked into the deep coves and did not come back for days or sometimes weeks. And when they did return, they were not injured or frightened, but deeply, profoundly rested, as though they had slept for the first time in their lives, and they spoke of the experience with a kind of reverent bewilderment, unable to explain where the time had gone, but certain that it had gone somewhere good, somewhere necessary, somewhere as essential to their continued existence as water or air. One such story concerns a man named Hollis, a timber surveyor in the 1920s who walked into a cove in the balsam range to assess the board feet of a stand of virgin spruce and was not seen for 11 days. And when he emerged at a crossroads store near Waynesville, lean and clear-eyed and carrying an expression that the storekeeper later described as beatific, he said only that he had been resting, that the forest had showed him a place where rest was possible, real rest, the kind that goes all the way down to the bottom of whatever you are. And he never surveyed timber again, choosing instead to spend his remaining years on a small farm at the edge of the same hollow, growing potatoes and listening to the creek and sitting, on certain nights, at the tree line where the managed world ended and the sleeping room began, breathing slowly, letting the draw pull his attention gently outward and downward into the darkness that had held him so completely that he never again felt the need to be held by anything else. And the descendants of Hollis still live on that farm, and they still sit at that tree line on certain nights, and the draw is still there, patient and constant and utterly without urgency, asking nothing, offering only the same thing it has always offered, the deep original rest that the mountain has been perfecting since before the first creature closed its first eyes and discovered that the darkness behind the lids was not empty but full, full of the same warmth and safety and infinite unhurried peace that fills these hollows now, tonight, as the fog rises and the owl calls and the creek murmurs its ancient wordless lullaby to the sleeping stone. The moss that covers the boulders in the creek bed of these deep coves has been growing for so long that it has developed a texture indistinguishable from velvet, a surface so fine and so uniform that touching it feels less like touching a plant than like touching the physical manifestation of gentleness itself. And when the fog condenses on its surface, the droplets are so small they are visible only as a sheen, a luminous dampness that catches whatever faint light reaches this depth of the forest and holds it the way the moss holds moisture, and the mountain holds silence with a completeness that suggests this is what these things were made for. This is their purpose. This is the reason the fog forms and the light descends and the moss grows, to create this single perfect surface of soft, wet luminescence at the bottom of a hollow that no one has named and no road has ever reached, a surface that exists for no audience and no purpose other than its own quiet being. And yet it is here. It has been here for centuries, and it will be here for centuries more, long after every story about these mountains has been told and forgotten and told again in a new language that has not yet been spoken. Let the thought of this moss settle into you the way moisture settles into the moss itself, slowly, by capillary action, drawn inward not by force, but by the gentle physics of attraction between surfaces that are made for each other, and let it soften whatever is still rigid in your thinking, whatever edge or corner of wakefulness is still holding its shape against the current of sleep that is moving through you now, with the same slow, patient inevitability with which the water moves through the rock and the fog moves through the hollow and time moves through the mountains, carrying everything gently, irresistibly, toward the place where all movement ceases, and all that remains is the soft, luminous stillness that has been waiting for you, that has always been waiting for you, at the bottom of the oldest mountains on earth. In the darkest hours, when even the barred owl has settled into silence, and the fog has filled the hollow so completely that the trees are visible only as vertical densities within the general grayness, there comes a moment, and you may be in that moment now, or approaching it, or already past it without having noticed. Because this is the nature of such moments, they do not announce themselves, but simply arrive, like the first snowflake of winter, or the first breath of a newborn, or the first photon of starlight that arrives after a journey of 10,000 years. A moment when the distinction between the listener and the listened to dissolves, when you are no longer a person in a forest, but a point of awareness within a field of awareness so vast that it includes the fog and the creek and the stone and the roots and the mycorrhizal web and the sleeping owl and the translucent salamander and the moss and the starlight and the geological memory of mountains that no longer exist and the promise of mountains that have not yet begun to rise, all of it held in a single, continuous, breathing present that is neither past nor future, but simply here, simply now, simply the eternal, unhurried unfolding of a universe that has been dreaming itself into existence for 13.8 billion years and shows no sign of waking. This is what the mountain offers to those who enter its sleeping rooms. This is what the draw is pulling you toward. This is the secret that the old families have been keeping, not because it is dangerous, but because it cannot be told, only experienced, the way warmth can only be experienced, the way rest can only be experienced, the way the slow, sweet dissolution of the boundary between self and world can only be experienced in the actual moment of its happening, which is now, which is always now, in the deep coves and the unnamed hollows, and the places search and rescue will not enter because there is nothing there to be rescued from, only something to be received into, the way the leaf is received by the soil, and the water is received by the stone, and the sound is received by the silence, and you, right now, are being received by the sleep that has been rising around you like fog, like the creek's low voice, like the slow tidal breathing of the oldest mountains on the planet, gathering you into itself with a gentleness that has been 400 million years in the perfecting. The last whippoorwill has finished its counting now, and the number it arrived at is a number that exists in no human mathematics, a number so large it contains within it every leaf that has ever fallen in these hollows, and every drop of rain that has ever been absorbed by this soil, and every heartbeat of every salamander that has ever pressed its translucent body against the underside of a stone in the creek bed, and felt the slow pulse of the mountain's warmth rising through the rock, and the bird has carried this number up into the fog where it dissolves, the way all numbers dissolve in the presence of the infinite, and what remains is not a quantity, but a quality, not a measurement, but a feeling, the feeling of being surrounded by more life and more time and more silence than the mind can hold, and the mind's response to this is not distress, but relief. The deep relief of finally encountering something too large to think about, something that can only be felt, something that asks the thinking mind to set down its tools and its measurements and its urgent lifelong project of keeping track and to simply rest, to simply be, to simply exist within the enormous gentle breathing fact of the mountain's presence the way a single cell exists within a body, aware of nothing beyond its own small sphere of warmth and moisture, and the steady, nourishing pulse that reaches it from somewhere vast and unseen, somewhere that has been sustaining it since before it knew it needed sustaining, since before the concept of need had been invented, since the very beginning of the very beginning, when the first atom found the first other atom in the darkness, and they held each other, and the holding was the start of everything. Arlene is asleep now on her porch, her tea grown cold in the cup beside her chair, and the fog has risen past the railing, and is touching her face with its cool, damp fingers, the way a mother touches the face of a sleeping child, checking for fever, finding none, finding only the warmth of a body at rest and the slow, steady breathing of a person who is surrendered completely to the night, and the hollow around her is breathing too. The rhododendron thickets and the hemlock cathedral and the unnamed creek and the sleeping salamanders and the moss-covered boulders and the roots that connect everything to everything in a web of such intricate and ancient design that to see it all at once would be to see the face of time itself. And time's face, if it could be seen, would look exactly like this. A dark hollow filled with fog, the faintest suggestion of starlight, the sound of water over stone, and everywhere the soft, unceasing breath of a mountain that has been exhaling this same breath since before the first eye opened, since before the first ear heard, since before the first mind wondered what it all meant. And the answer to that wondering, if there is one, is not a meaning but a feeling. The feeling you are feeling now as the last threads of wakefulness loosen and fall away, and you find yourself in the place you have been moving toward all along. The sleeping room at the center of the oldest mountains, the place where the draw has been gently, patiently, lovingly pulling you since the first word of this story reached your ears, the place where there is nothing to do and nothing to know, and nothing to hold on to except the warmth and the darkness and the fog and the silence and the deep, abiding assurance that you are held, that you have always been held, that the mountain has been holding you since before you were born and will go on holding you long after you have been folded back into the earth like a leaf, like a stone, like a story told so many times it has become part of the landscape, part of the silence, part of the long, slow, beautiful dream of the Appalachian dark. And the night continues in the way that nights in these hollows have always continued, without event, without interruption, without the need for anything to happen at all, because happening is the business of the waking world. And this is the sleeping world, the world beneath the world that the fog reveals and the daylight conceals. And in this world, the creek goes on murmuring, and the owl goes on dreaming on its branch, and the salamander goes on pulsing beneath its stone, and the roots go on whispering their slow chemical conversations, and the moss goes on growing at a pace that makes glaciers look hasty. And all of it is held within the cupped hands of these ancient, rounded, endlessly patient mountains that have been performing this same act of holding since the continents were joined and the oceans were one. And the sky was a different composition of gases, and the stars were in different positions. And yet the holding was the same, the warmth was the same. The darkness was the same, because these things do not change, cannot change. They are the constants beneath the variables, the stillness beneath the motion, the silence beneath the sound. And they are here now as they have always been here, wrapping themselves around you like the fog wraps around the trees, and the night wraps around the hollow, and the mountain wraps around the night, layer upon layer upon layer of gentleness, going all the way down to the center of the earth, and all the way up to the farthest star, and all the way back to the beginning of time, and all the way forward to its end, which is not an end at all, but a return, a homecoming, a settling into the same soft, dark, warm, breathing stillness that was there at the start and will be there at the finish and is here now, right now, holding everything, holding you in the ancient, sacred, sleeping heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The fog thickens and the hollow deepens and the night goes on and on and on, unhurried, unmeasured, unconcerned with the passage of hours, because hours are a human invention. And this place predates humanity the way the ocean predates a wave. And in this timelessness, the temperature drops by one more imperceptible degree, and the moisture in the air condenses by one more invisible fraction, and the moss grows by one more infinitesimal increment, and the mountain settles by one more unmeasurable amount toward the center of the earth that holds it. And all of these tiny, patient, unhurried changes are the mountain's way of dreaming, of processing the long, complex, infinitely detailed experience of being a mountain. And tonight, you are part of that dream, woven into it as naturally as the fog is woven into the air, and the water is woven into the stone, and the silence is woven into the spaces between the trees. And there is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do, and no one else you need to become. Because in the mountain's dream, you are already complete, already whole, already exactly what this moment requires, which is a warm body at rest, a slow breath in a dark place, a consciousness that has set down its burdens and allowed itself to be carried, the way the creek carries the leaf, and the wind carries the fog, and the night carries the mountain, and the mountain carries the night, each one holding the other in an embrace so old and so complete that the question of who is holding whom has long since ceased to have meaning, dissolved like a handful of mist into the vast, gentle, all-encompassing dark. Sleep now, the way the mountain sleeps, the way the hollow sleeps, the way the fog sleeps as it drifts through the sleeping trees. And know that you are part of something so ancient and so tender and so endlessly, patiently, beautifully alive that the word sleep is not quite right for what it does, because it never truly rests. It only deepens, forever deepening, forever breathing, forever holding the world in its soft, dark, luminous, unfathomable arms. There is a map that lives not on paper, but in the memory of hands, in the way the oldest ranger at the Pisgah station traces a line along the ridge with his finger without ever looking down, his nail following a contour he has carried in his body for 40 years the way a river carries the shape of its bed. And tonight, we are going to follow that invisible line together, not into danger, never into danger, but into the deep and luminous stillness that exists in places where human footsteps grow rare, and then rarer still, and then cease altogether, where the forest floor has not felt the press of a boot sole in so many seasons that the moss has grown thick as velvet and undisturbed as the silence at the bottom of a well, and where the mountains themselves, those impossibly ancient mountains that were already wearing down when the dinosaurs were young, hold the darkness not as something to fear, but as something precious, something they have been keeping safe for longer than any mind can fathom, the way a grandmother keeps a quilt folded in a cedar chest, waiting for the right cold night to spread it out and let its weight settle over everything. The map in his memory marks the cairn lines, those low stacks of lichen-covered stone that someone built so long ago that no one living can say who placed the first one. And the cairns themselves have become part of the mountain in the way that all patient things eventually merge with the landscape that holds them, the quartz and granite and gneiss of their stacking, now furred with the same pale green and silver that covers the exposed rock faces of the balds. And he will tell you quietly, if you sit with him long enough beside the wood stove in the station house while the coffee grows cold and the afternoon light thickens to amber, that the cairn lines are not warnings exactly but invitations to pause, to recognize a threshold the way you might recognize the moment between waking and sleep, that soft and unmistakable border where the rules of one world gently give way to the rules of another, and that beyond them the mountains become something older than anything he has language for, something that does not need or want human presence, but that tolerates it the way the ocean tolerates a single floating leaf, with an indifference so vast it becomes, from a certain angle, indistinguishable from tenderness. We will not cross those cairn lines tonight, not because there is anything to fear in the crossing, but because there is no need, because everything we came here to find, the quiet, the ancient dark, the feeling of being held inside something so enormous and so patient that all the noise of the waking world simply cannot reach us. All of that begins right here, in the sheltered hollow where we have made our camp among the oldest balsam firs on this ridge, their trunks silver with age and resinous, with a scent that seems to come from some deeper place than the wood itself, as though the trees have been slowly distilling the mountain air for centuries, and are now, in the cooling of this particular evening, releasing it back in long, unhurried exhalations that settle over our small clearing like a benediction spoken in a language older than speech. And above us, far above, the bald rises treeless and immense against a sky that is just now beginning to deepen from the last pale lavender of dusk into the first true blue of night, a blue so rich and so saturated it seems almost to have weight, almost to be pressing gently downward. And we feel it. We feel that gentle pressure. And it is good. It is the same pressure that presses a seed deeper into the earth, that presses a stone deeper into the stream bed, that presses a sleeping body deeper into the mattress. And we welcome it. We let it do its slow and ancient work. The fire we have built is small and deliberate, a careful architecture of rhododendron wood that the ranger showed us how to stack in the old way, the pieces fitted together like the fingers of two hands clasping, and it burns with a sweetness that is almost floral, a smoke that rises in a thin, unwavering column through the still air of the hollow, before dissolving somewhere above the canopy into the general darkening of the sky. And the heat it gives is the particular kind of heat that seems to know exactly where your body is coldest, finding the stiffness in your shoulders and the chill along the backs of your hands, and replacing it with a warmth that feels less like temperature and more like permission. Permission to stop holding yourself together. Permission to let the muscles of your face soften and your breathing slow and your thoughts begin to move with the unhurried drift of that smoke, rising and thinning and dissolving into something vast and untroubled. The firelight catches the trunk of the nearest balsam and turns its silver bark to copper, to bronze, to the color of very old honey. And beyond that lit trunk, the forest stands in its own particular darkness, not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of saturation, of so much accumulated life and time and quiet, that the eye simply cannot take it all in. And so the mind translates it as shadow, as depth, as the visual equivalent of a low, sustained note played on an instrument too large to see. Somewhere out in that darkness, a barred owl calls, and the sound arrives not as a sharp intrusion, but as a confirmation, a voice that has been part of this hollow's evening chorus for so many generations of owls that it has become indistinguishable from the hollow itself, woven into the acoustic fabric of the place like a thread in a tapestry so old that no one can remember when it was added. And the call moves through the balsam canopy with the unhurried certainty of water finding its way downhill, each note round and full and followed by a silence that seems not empty but pregnant, as though the forest is listening to the echo of the call the way a bell listens to its own fading resonance, savoring it, holding it, letting it thin to nothing before the next call comes. You hear it, and something in your chest loosens. Some knot you did not know you were carrying begins to work itself free, because the owl is not calling to you and is not calling about you. And there is in that complete disregard a strange and perfect comfort, the comfort of being present in a place that does not need you to do anything, that does not need you to be anything, that asks only that you breathe and listen and let the warmth of the fire find the places where you are cold. The ranger, whose name is Harlan, though he rarely offers it and never insists upon it, has settled into the camp chair beside you with the particular ease of a man who has spent more nights in these mountains than in any building. And his silence is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understands that some conversations are best conducted without words, that the fire and the owl and the slow deepening of the dark are saying everything that needs to be said. And when he does speak, after a long while, his voice comes low and unhurried, shaped by the same cadence as the owl's call. And he says only, "These mountains remember things that happened before there was anything alive to see them happen." And then he is quiet again, and the words settle into the hollow like leaves, settling onto the surface of a still pond, resting there without sinking, turning slowly in the firelight. You do not need to respond, and he does not expect you to. And this mutual understanding fills the space between you with a warmth that has nothing to do with the fire. And somewhere above the canopy the first true stars are appearing, not all at once but one by one, as though someone very patient is lighting them individually, taking care with each one. And the stars above the Appalachian balds have a quality that stars in other places do not possess, a closeness and intimacy, as though the ancient height of these mountains, worn down though they are from their primordial vastness, still brings you just close enough to the sky that the distance between your eye and the nearest star becomes, for a moment, almost negotiable, almost something you could cross if you were very still and very patient and willing to let go of everything that holds you to the ground. The temperature has dropped in the way it drops on the high ridges, not gradually but in a single gentle step, as though the mountain has drawn a cool cloth across its own forehead, and you feel it on the skin of your face and the tips of your ears, a freshness that is not uncomfortable but clarifying, the way cold water is clarifying when you splash it on your face in the morning and the fire responds by seeming to burn warmer, the contrast between the cool air on your back and the radiant heat on your chest and hands, creating a sensation that is deeply, primitively soothing, the sensation of a body finding the exact boundary between two temperatures and resting there, balanced, held, the way a hawk is held at the meeting point of two currents of air, effortless and still. Harlan reaches down and places another piece of rhododendron on the fire with the precision of someone placing a book back on a shelf, finding the exact right spot by feel and by instinct. And the wood catches quickly, sending a brief constellation of sparks upward through the dark canopy, each spark a tiny ember that traces its own brief bright arc against the black branches before winking out. And you watch them rise and disappear. And it occurs to you, in the soft and loosening way that thoughts occur when the body is warm and the mind is quieting, that those sparks are doing exactly what you are doing, rising for a moment into the vast dark and then letting go, dissolving back into the greater silence, and that there is nothing sad in this, nothing sad at all, only the immense and gentle rhythm of things appearing and disappearing within a darkness that holds them all. Beyond the hollow, beyond the last of the balsam firs where the tree line gives way to the open bald, the grass is moving in a wind you cannot feel down here in the shelter of the trees. And if you listen carefully, beneath the crackle of the fire and the occasional distant call of the owl, you can hear that wind as a continuous, almost subliminal whisper, the sound of 10,000 grass stems bending and straightening and bending again, a sound so constant and so even that it becomes, after a while, indistinguishable from silence itself, the way the hum of the earth's turning would sound if your ears were sensitive enough to hear it. And this sound, this wind sound, this grass sound, this almost silence, is what the search and rescue crews speak of when they talk about the balds after dark, not with fear, but with a kind of reverence. The reverence you might feel standing in an empty cathedral whose builders have been forgotten, but whose stones still hold the shape of some intention so vast and so patient that it has outlasted every language that might have named it. The wind on the bald is the mountain breathing, and the mountain breathes slowly, each inhalation drawn across miles of ridge, and each exhalation released into the valley below, with a gentleness that belies the geological violence of the mountain's birth, the tectonic collisions and volcanic upheavals that raised these peaks to Himalayan heights 400 million years ago, heights that have since been worn down by rain and ice, and the patient, ceaseless work of roots cracking stone, worn down to these soft, rounded shapes that look less like mountains and more like the bodies of enormous sleeping animals, their fur the forest, their breath the wind, their dreams, whatever dreams are dreamt by things that have been sleeping for longer than the human mind can hold. Harlan pours coffee from a thermos that has seen so many seasons in these mountains that its original color is a matter of speculation, and he hands you a cup without asking if you want one, because up here, the offering of warmth is not a question, but a fact, as fundamental as the fire itself, and the coffee is strong and sweet and has been kept at the exact temperature where it warms without burning, the temperature of a hand held against a sun-warmed stone in late afternoon. And you hold the cup in both hands and let the heat travel through the ceramic into your palms and from your palms into the network of small muscles and fine bones that make up the architecture of your hands. And those muscles, which have been gripping and typing and holding and carrying all the weight of the waking world, begin to soften and release, and the releasing moves up your wrists and into your forearms, and you realize that the warmth of the cup is doing what the warmth of the fire has been doing, what the warmth of the balsam-scented air has been doing, what the warmth of Harlan's unhurried silence has been doing, which is to gently, patiently, with all the time in the world, convince your body that it is safe, that it is held, that it can stop standing guard over itself and simply rest, the way the stones of the cairn line rest against one another, each one bearing only its own weight, each one supported by the ones beneath it, all of them held in place by nothing more than gravity and patience and the slow accumulation of years beyond counting. The owl calls again, closer this time, and you hear the air displaced by its wings as it passes through the canopy above your clearing, a sound less like a bird in flight and more like a thought moving through a sleeping mind, weightless and deliberate and gone before you can fully register it. And Harlan tips his chin upward slightly in acknowledgement, the way you might nod to a neighbor passing on a road. And this small gesture tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between this man and this place, that he is not a visitor here, but neither is he an owner, that he exists in the hollow the way the owl exists in the canopy and the fire exists in its ring of stones, as a temporary arrangement of warmth and attention within a vastness that will continue long after all of them have gone. And this is not a melancholy thought, but a profoundly restful one, the thought that lets the last thread of tension in your shoulders finally unwind. Because if the mountains do not need you to hold them up, then you can stop trying. You can let your spine settle against the back of the chair and your head tilt slightly to one side, and your eyes, which have been watching the fire, begin to soften their focus until the flames become less a specific thing and more a general impression of warmth and light and gentle movement, an impression that fills your vision the way a lullaby fills a room. The rhododendron wood in the fire has reached that stage of burning where the bark has fallen away, and the heartwood glows with an interior light, a deep and steady amber that does not flicker but pulses, slowly, as though the wood remembers the pulse of sap that once moved through it, the slow spring rhythm of sugar and water rising from root to crown. And this pulsing light casts soft shadows on the balsam trunks around the clearing, shadows that move with the same unhurried rhythm, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping animal. And you begin to notice that your own breathing has matched itself to this rhythm, without any effort or intention on your part, the way a sleeping child's breathing matches itself to the breathing of the parent who holds them, chest rising and falling in unconscious sympathy, in the ancient, wordless agreement between two bodies that they are safe enough to synchronize, safe enough to let down every guard, safe enough to breathe in the same time and the same way, drawing in the same sweet resinous air and releasing it back into the same encompassing dark. Harlan speaks again, and his voice is quieter now, pitched at the level of the fire's murmur, and he says, "The crews call them dead zones, but that's not right. That's never been right." And he pauses, and the pause is long enough for the owl to call once more, farther away now, moving along the ridge in its own unhurried survey of the night. And then he continues, "They're not dead. They're just so alive in a way we don't have the equipment to measure that it overwhelms the instruments. The way a sound too low to hear will still rattle the windows. The way a light too dim to see will still find the back of your eye and do its work there in the dark. And you understand what he means not with your thinking mind, but with something deeper, something in the body that recognizes the truth of it, because you can feel it right now, in this hollow, this aliveness that is not excitement or stimulation, but something more fundamental. The aliveness of stone slowly cooling at the end of a long day. The aliveness of roots drawing water in the dark. The aliveness of the mountain itself resting under its blanket of forest, with the enormous patience of a thing that has been alive for 400 million years and is in no hurry whatsoever. Above the canopy, the sky has completed its transition from dusk to full dark, and the stars have multiplied beyond counting. And here, on the high ridge, above the light pollution of any town and above the thickest layers of atmosphere, the Milky Way is visible not as a faint suggestion, but as a physical presence, a river of light that arches across the sky with the same gentle curve as the ridge itself, as though the mountain and the galaxy are reflections of each other, one made of stone and one made of light, but both shaped by the same patient forces, gravity and time, and the slow accumulation of matter drawn together by the simple fact that matter, like warmth, like sleep, like the pull you feel right now toward the soft center of yourself, tends always toward closeness, toward gathering, toward the deep and dreamless rest at the heart of all things. You look up through a gap in the balsam canopy, and the stars look back. And their looking is not observation, but companionship. The companionship of 10,000 ancient fires, burning in a silence so vast that it makes the silence of the hollow seem almost chatty by comparison. And yet there is no loneliness in it, no cold, because the distance between you and the nearest star is made of the same substance as the distance between your hand and the cup of coffee you are holding. Which is to say, it is made of nothing at all. It is simply the space in which warmth travels, the medium through which light finds its way from one point of brightness to another. The fire has settled into its deepest phase, the phase where it no longer needs tending and will burn on its own through the small hours with the self-sufficiency of an old friend who knows when to talk and when to simply sit. and the heat it gives now comes not in waves, but in a constant, even radiance, like the warmth of a wall that has been in the sun all day and is now releasing that stored heat back into the cooling room, molecule by molecule, unhurried and exact. And this radiance wraps around you like the heaviest and softest wool, the kind of wool that comes from sheep that have grazed on high mountain meadows where the grass is sweetened by altitude, and the wool grows thick and dense against the cold, and you can feel it on your arms and your chest and the tops of your thighs, this phantom wool, this radiant weight, and it is pressing you gently downward, not toward the ground, but toward something beneath the ground, toward the bedrock of the mountain itself, toward the deep. Cool, untroubled stratum of stone that has been here since before the first tree grew on this ridge, since before the first rain fell on this slope, since before the first star appeared in this particular corner of the sky. A sound reaches you from the bald above, or perhaps it is not a sound, but the absence of one, a deepening of the quiet that signals the wind has paused in its ceaseless movement across the grass. And in that pause, the mountain seems to hold its breath, and you hold yours with it. Not out of suspense, but out of sympathy, the way you might hold your breath when a baby is falling asleep in your arms and you do not want to disturb the delicate process by which consciousness releases its grip and the body surrenders to the dark, and then the wind returns gently, so gently, and the grass resumes its whispering, and you resume your breathing, and the mountain resumes its long, slow exhalation, and everything is as it was. Everything is as it has always been, the fire burning, the stars turning, the forest holding its darkness like a cup holds water, steady and deep and brimming with a stillness that is not emptiness, but fullness. The fullness of a place that has had 400 million years to fill itself with silence, and has used every one of them. Harlan has closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in the particular kind of attentiveness that comes when the visual world is released, and the other senses expand to fill the space it leaves. And you can see by the firelight that his face has taken on the same expression the mountain wears, the expression of something that has seen so much, that seeing is no longer the primary mode of knowing, that has listened so long and so well that listening has become a kind of seeing. And in his stillness, he seems to merge with the chair, and the chair with the ground, and the ground with the mountain. A chain of resting that extends downward through the soil and the clay and the fractured rock to the deep heart of the Appalachian bedrock, gneiss and granite and schist, metamorphic stone that has been compressed and heated and compressed again by forces that make the strongest human effort seem like a child pressing a thumb into clay. And this stone, this ancient foundation, is what you rest on now. What holds the fire and the hollow and the balsam firs and the bald and the cairn line and the stars themselves. Or seems to, because from down here, from the warm and fire-lit center of this small circle of safety, the mountain seems large enough to hold everything, seems to extend not just downward into the earth, but upward into the sky, its stone merging with the dark, which merges with the space between the stars, which merges with the silence that was here before anything else, and will be here after everything else has gone. The coffee is cooled in your cup to the temperature of your own blood, and you no longer taste it so much as feel it, a presence of warmth and sweetness that has become part of the general warmth and sweetness of the evening, indistinguishable from the balsam scent and the fire's radiance and the soft wool of the blanket that has been draped across your knees at some point. You cannot remember when. Perhaps Harlan placed it there. Perhaps you drew it up yourself in one of those semi-conscious gestures that the body makes when it is already halfway to sleep, the gestures of self-tending that continue even as the mind loosens its hold, the way a bird tucks its head beneath its wing without waking, the way a deer folds its legs beneath itself in a motion so practiced and so fluid that it is less a decision than a rhythm, a note in the long, slow song that the body sings to itself when it is ready to rest. The blanket is heavy, heavier than it looks, and it carries the scent of cedar and wood smoke and something else, something green and mineral, the scent of the mountain itself, as though the wool has absorbed the exhalations of the balsam firs and the breath of the stone and the cold, clean emptiness of the bald above. And wearing it feels less like wearing a blanket and more like wearing a layer of the mountain's own atmosphere, warm and close and infused with the specific gravity of a place that has been accumulating presence for millennia upon millennia. Down in the valley, so far below that it might as well be another world, a creek is moving over stones that were once part of this ridge, stones that were broken free by frost and carried downward by water over the course of centuries, each stone wearing smoother and smaller with each season's flood. And the sound of that creek reaches you now as the faintest possible thread of music, a sound so thin and so continuous that it weaves itself into the silence without disturbing it, the way a single silver thread woven into a dark tapestry catches the light now and then without changing the overall impression of depth and shadow. You cannot hear the individual notes of the water, cannot distinguish one stone's voice from another at this distance, but you can feel the general movement of it, the patient, downhill pull that has been drawing water from these ridges since the mountains first rose from the ancient seafloor. And this pull is another version of the pull you feel now, the downward pull of sleep, the gravitational attraction that the body feels toward rest. The way water feels toward the sea, inevitable and gentle and requiring nothing from you but the willingness to stop resisting, to let yourself be carried in the direction you were always going to go. The owl has returned, or perhaps it is a different owl, one that lives in the hollow below the bald where the hemlocks grow so thick that the ground beneath them has not seen direct sunlight in decades. And this owl's call is deeper, rounder, shaped by the acoustic properties of the hemlock grove, the way a voice is shaped by the room in which it speaks. And the two calls, the barred owl above and this deeper voice below, create between them a kind of frame, a sonic boundary that encloses the hollow in a space of sound that feels as safe and as defined as the ring of firelight that encloses your camp. And within this frame of owl song and firelight, you are held, doubly held, held by sound and held by warmth. And beyond both of these holdings, you are held by the mountain itself, by its mass and its patience and its 400 million year commitment to being exactly where it is, not going anywhere, not becoming anything other than what it has always been, which is a place of rest, a place where the urgent motion of the tectonic plates finally came to stillness, and the stone that had been traveling for eons finally stopped and settled and began the long, sweet process of wearing down, of letting the rain and the wind and the roots smooth away its rough edges, until what remains is this: these soft and ancient shapes, these rounded ridges that look like nothing so much as the body of a sleeper seen from a great height, curled beneath a quilt of forest, breathing slowly, dreaming of the sea. Harlan shifts in his chair, and the motion is so small and so slow that it might be the settling of a branch or the adjustment of a stone, and he opens his eyes enough to check the fire, which does not need checking, but which he checks anyway, out of the same deep habit that makes a parent glance at a sleeping child, not out of worry but out of love, the love that expresses itself as attention, as the willingness to keep watch over something precious even when no danger threatens. And he sees that the fire is good, that it will burn for hours yet, and he closes his eyes again, and his breathing deepens, and you hear in his breathing the same rhythm you hear in the wind on the bald and the pulse of the embers and the distant murmur of the creek and your own breath, all of them moving in the same time, all of them carried by the same current, the current that moves through everything alive and everything that has ever been alive and everything that will ever be alive on this mountain, the current that is not time exactly and not music exactly, but something that contains both, something that the mountain has been conducting since before there were ears to hear it. A symphony played on instruments of stone and water and wood and wind and starlight, played so slowly that a single movement takes 1,000 years to complete. And we are hearing it now, we are inside it now, we are part of it now, and the part we play is rest, is quiet, is the soft and steady note of a body letting go. The stars have wheeled imperceptibly since we first looked up at them, Orion's belt tilting by a degree or two toward the western ridge. And this motion, this cosmic ticking of the sky's great clock, is so slow as to be visible only to someone who has been watching for a very long time. or to someone who is not watching with their eyes but with the deeper instrument of the body's own sense of time, the circadian rhythm that knows without being told that the night has reached its deepest point, the point where the temperature is lowest and the darkness is most complete and the silence is most absolute, the still center around which the night turns like a wheel turns around its axle. And this is the hour in which sleep comes most naturally, most completely, because the body recognizes this center the way a compass needle recognizes north, with a certainty that requires no thought, no effort, no decision, only the surrender to a direction that was always there, always pulling, always waiting for the moment when you stopped resisting and let yourself turn. The balsam firs around the clearing have taken on their nighttime character, which is different from their daytime character the way a pond at night is different from a pond by day. The same substance rearranged by darkness into something more mysterious and more beautiful. Their silver trunks glowing faintly in the firelight like the columns of a cathedral, whose ceiling is the sky itself, and the branches that by day filter the sunlight into a green and dappled shade now hold the darkness in their needles the way a sponge holds water, dense and heavy and full, and the fragrance they release is stronger at night, deeper, as though the trees open some interior chamber after dark and let the concentrated essence of their lives pour out into the cooling air. And you breathe it in, and it fills not just your lungs, but something behind your lungs. Some deeper reservoir that the body keeps for the intake of things that are not quite air and not quite scent, but something more nourishing than either, something that feeds the part of you that is tired in ways that sleep alone cannot always reach. The tiredness that comes from being too long in places that are too new and too loud and too bright. The tiredness that can only be cured by contact with something ancient and quiet and dark, something like this forest, this fire, this mountain, this night. If you were to walk to the edge of the hollow and look up at the bald, which you will not do because you are too warm and too comfortable and too deep in the downward drift of approaching sleep, but if you were to, you would see the cairn line silhouetted against the star field, the low shapes of the stacked stones just barely distinguishable from the natural rock outcroppings that surround them. And you would see that the cairns are not a wall or a fence, but a suggestion, a gentle marking of the place where one kind of silence gives way to another kind, the way the tree line marks the place where one kind of life gives way to another. Not lesser, but different, not darker, but deeper. And beyond the cairn line, the bald stretches upward to the summit, bare and silver in the starlight, the grass so pale it seems to glow with its own internal luminescence, and the sky above it is not a ceiling but an opening, not a boundary but a continuation. And the place where the mountain ends and the sky begins is not a line but a gradation, a slow dissolving of stone into air, into darkness, into light, into space. And somewhere in that dissolving is the secret that the search and rescue crews sense but cannot name, the secret that keeps them within the cairn line after dark, not out of fear, but out of the same instinct that keeps you at the edge of a dream, knowing that to go further would be to lose the thread that connects you to the waking world, and that the losing would not be frightening, but would be so peaceful, so complete, so utterly and finally restful that you might not ever want to find the thread again. But that is a journey for another night or for no night at all, and tonight we are here, in the hollow, within the cairn line, within the ring of firelight, within the embrace of the balsam firs and the wool blanket and the heat of the rhododendron embers and the vast sheltering indifference of the mountain that holds us all. And Harlan's breathing has deepened into the slow, even rhythm of true sleep, his chest rising and falling with the same cadence as the wind on the bald. And you realize that you trust this man to sleep because he trusts this place to keep him, trusts it, the way a stone trusts the mountain it rests upon, with the absolute and unquestioning confidence of a thing that has been held for so long that the possibility of falling has become not frightening, but simply inconceivable. And you feel that same trust building in your own body, not in your mind, which is already too soft and too far away to build anything, but in your body, in the muscles that have finally stopped holding, and the joints that have finally stopped bracing, and the spine that has finally stopped resisting its own curve and has settled fully and gratefully into the shape that the chair and the blanket and the gravity of this ancient mountain have been patiently offering it all evening. The fire murmurs, and the owls have gone silent, which means they are hunting or resting or simply listening to the same deep quiet that you are listening to, the quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of an attention so vast that it swallows all sound the way the ocean swallows a raindrop. And in this quiet you can hear, or you imagine you can hear, the mountain itself, not a sound, exactly, but a vibration, a resonance, the hum of 400 million years of accumulated existence. And this hum is so low and so deep that it does not enter through your ears, but through your bones, through the calcium and phosphorus that make up your skeleton, minerals that were once part of some ancient stone, some primordial bedrock that has been broken down and recycled and passed through so many forms that it has lost all memory of what it was and yet retains, in its crystalline structure, the same ability to resonate, the same affinity for vibration, the same deep attunement to the frequency at which mountains dream, and you are dreaming now, or nearly dreaming. The border between waking and sleep has become as soft and as permeable as the border between the mountain and the sky. And you are crossing it the way mist crosses a ridge, effortlessly, invisibly, without disturbing anything on either side. The last thing you notice before the crossing is complete is the quality of the air on your face, cool and sweet and carrying the faintest trace of the bald's grass. Scent mixed with the balsam's resin and the fire's smoke and the mineral tang of old stone warmed by ancient processes deep below the surface. And this air feels like a hand on your forehead, gentle and cool and infinitely patient, the hand of a parent or a mountain or a night that has been waiting for you specifically, waiting for this particular arrangement of warmth and quiet and darkness that would allow you to finally let go. And you let go, not all at once, but in stages, the way a leaf lets go of a branch, first loosening its grip, then hanging by a single thread of attachment, then releasing even that and falling. But the falling feels like floating, and the floating feels like resting, and the resting feels like coming home to a place you have never been but have always known, a place as old and as deep and as safe as the stone heart of the mountain itself. And the mountain holds you, as it has held the forest and the bald and the cairn line and the wind and the owls and the creek and the stars and every sleeping creature that has ever curled within the shelter of its hollows, holds you with the effortless strength of a thing that has been practicing the art of holding for longer than anything else on this continent has existed, holds you the way the dark holds the light of the fire, not extinguishing it, but cradling it, defining it, giving it a place to be bright, and you are that brightness now, small and warm and alive in the vast cradling dark. And the dark is not empty. The dark is full of the breathing of the balsam firs and the resonance of the stone and the slow turning of the stars and the deep, untroubled sleep of a man named Harlan who trusts this mountain with his life, because he has given it his life, night after night, season after season, and the mountain has never once failed to hold him, has never once failed to carry him through the dark hours and deliver him, rested and whole, to the first pale light of morning. But morning is far away, so far that it might as well be another age, another era, another geological epoch. And between now and then there is only this, the fire and the dark and the wool and the stone and the slow, sweet turning of the sky above the bald. And you are sinking now, sinking through the layers of the evening, the way the creek's water sinks through layers of soil and stone, each layer filtering out something, first the noise, then the worry, then the thought, then the memory of thought, then the memory of the memory, until what reaches the deepest level is nothing but the purest, clearest, most essential thing, which is rest, which is silence, which is the ground note of existence itself, the note that was playing before the mountains rose and will be playing after they have worn away to sand, the note that every sleeping thing hears and every dreaming thing moves to and every waking thing forgets and every evening remembers, the note that is playing now, here, in this hollow, in this fire, in this breath, in this slow and beautiful surrender to the oldest and most generous impulse in the universe, which is the impulse to hold still, to hold close, to hold safe, to hold. And you are held. And the mountain breathes, and the fire burns low and sweet and steady, and the stars turn, and the dark is warm. And you rest.